Resurrexit, sicut dixit, Alleluia, ora pro nobis Deum, Alleluia.
Listen carefully, my son, to the Master's instructions, and attend to them with the ear of your heart. This is advice from a Father who loves you. Welcome it and faithfully put it into practice. Welcome to the first session in our online Discernment Retreat. I'm Brother John Mark Falkenhain. I'm the Vocation Director for St. Meinrad Archabbey, and I'm speaking to you today from the chapter room at St. Meinrad. This is a fascinating room. It's rather fantastic. The entire room is painted by a monk from the 1940s who was here from Belgium at the time of the Second World War. The chapter room is the room in the monastery where all of the monks do their business. And so it's fitting that we start our discernment retreat here, because it's also here that the monks vote on new members and where the petitions for new members are read to the monastic community. A chapter room is called a chapter room because in monastic tradition, all of the monks gather every day for a chapter of the rule to be read. And so the room where the monks would gather all the way through the Middle Ages was always referred to as the chapter room. But it is the room where we do the business of our monastery. Thank you for joining us. Let's begin with a prayer. Lord God, you are the author of our lives. We thank you for the life that you have given us and the life that is to come. We ask that you give us grace, that our ears might be open to hear how you call us, that our eyes might be open to the wonders and the signs that you provide for us, and that in the end you open our mouths that we may tell of your glory. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In our first conference today, I just want to set up the whole process of discernment and talking about a vocation, the context for what we're discerning. A couple of years ago when I was giving a discernment retreat, I thought to look up the word discern. We use it all the time, but what exactly does it mean? I can't remember if it was the Oxford Dictionary or the New Webster's, but I was really struck by the definition as making a decision with some work based on the information that you have available to you. Usually we just think about discernment as making a decision. It's nice that they included the piece with some work, because discernment really does seem to be work. It's something that causes us some toil and sometimes some anxiety. So to make a decision with some work using the information that you have available to you. And certainly that's what we do when we discern a vocation. We look at what are the signs and what is the information that I have to decide what I am to do with my life. Now, a lot of us think about our vocation as something very, very specific. And sometimes we can get ourselves caught in the trap of thinking about our vocation and discerning our vocation as trying to figure out what is in God's mind. I know for myself, I used to have the idea that God had chosen something for me that I was supposed to do with my life. And it was as if he had written it down on a cue card and sealed it up in an envelope and put it in his breast pocket. And it was my job, as someone who was discerning his vocation, to try to figure out what it was that God had written on that cue card. I'm not sure that that's the best way to think about it, because if you do, then our discernment becomes like this gigantic one-question life final exam, and it would cause us lots and lots of anxiety. Rather, I like to think a little bit more broadly. When I was discerning my vocation myself, I was thinking about lots of things, and I remember having a conversation once with a vocation director for the Christian Brothers. This was several years ago, and he gave me a piece of advice that was perhaps one of the most helpful that I had gotten. He said to me at the time, "You know, Mark, I don't know that you are really just called to be a Christian brother. I think it's possible that God calls us to many things, many possibilities, because really it's the same qualities that I see in you that would make you a good Christian brother, that would actually make you a good husband, or a good parent, or a good priest, or a good monk. It was the first time I had realized the possibility that God could be calling us to lots of different things. Now, that doesn't get us any further along our path necessarily just yet, but it will. So the fact that God could be calling us to lots of different things helps me to make sense, and I hope it makes you to make sense, of sometimes our experience that we could imagine ourselves happy as a married person, or happy as a priest, or happy as a consecrated religious, a monk, or a Franciscan, or a Marianist. The truth is, all of these vocations in the church require so many of the same attitudes, the attitude of generosity and self-gift and love of God. And so that should free us to some degree and help us to make sense of our desire at times to live different kinds of lives. Of course, in the end, we just get to pick one, and we have to discern carefully which one we are going to pick. Now, this idea also caused me several years ago to think more broadly in terms of, well, if God doesn't have one super specific thing in mind for me, what does God have in his mind for me? And it's when I realized that our primary call, our primary vocation is much, much more basic. And that is simply this. It is to be what I say the goodest, and I like that word better than best here because it doesn't have a competitive edge to it that doesn't quite fit, but to be the goodest, most Christ-like person that I can be. That is what my call in life is. In fact, it's our baptismal call. It's the call that we receive and our parents help us to respond to when we are baptized. It is the call to conversion, to become the very most Christ-like person that we can be. And that call begins at our baptism and carries on throughout the rest of our Christian and our Catholic lives. Now, that's important to consider, because if that is our primary call, then when it comes to deciding what our vocation is going to be, the vocation that we discern later in life, then we have to realize that whether I am a monk, or whether I am a priest, or a parent, or a spouse, that vocation is really the flowering. It grows out of, it is the fruit of our primary baptismal call, which is to be the goodest, most Christ-like person that I can be. That means that when I am discerning what my vocation is going to be, I have to be convinced, I have to know that this vocation that I choose is going to both support me and especially challenge me in responding to that primary call. This is the life, the vocation, the relationship that I'm going to choose because I am convinced that it is going to allow me to respond to the call of being the goodest, most Christ-like person that I can be. Now, let me say a couple of things about the monastic life. When I think about myself as a vocation director, I think that I have two jobs. My job as a vocation director is not really to try to convince anyone or to talk anyone into joining the monastery. I don't think that's fair, and it doesn't usually work. I think my job as the vocation director really is to give the inquirer, to give you, as much information about the monastic life, and in particular the monastic life at St. Meinrad, as you would need to be able to discern whether or not you are called to this life. The second job that I have as a vocation director is then to offer any kind of advice or tips on discernment that I might be able to offer people. So in the course of these vocation conferences, I'm going to be working out of both of those roles, to tell you a little bit about St. Meinrad, a little bit about the monastic life, and then also to offer when I can what are some tips, what are some ways of thinking about discernment to help you further along your path. So I speak a little bit about the monastic life here. A lot of people, when they first come and look at the monastic life and they consider the monastic life, they're inhibited a little bit by a couple of myths that are common. The first one is that people often believe that you have to be really holy to be a monk. That, oh, I could never be a monk, I'm just not holy enough, I'm not good enough. In fact, Sometimes if you tell someone, oh, I'm thinking about joining a monastery, they think, oh, I could never do that, I'm just not holy enough. But that's really a misconception, because holiness is the goal of the monastic life. It's not the requirement. And it says so right here at the very beginning of St. Benedict's rule. In the prologue, which I started reading from at the very beginning of our conference today, St. Benedict continues on a little later, and he says this: seeking his workmen in a multitude of people, the Lord calls out to him and lifts his voice again, "Is there anyone here who yearns for life and desires to see good days?" I'm going to repeat it. Seeking his workmen in a multitude of people, the Lord calls out to him and lifts his voice again, "Is there anyone here who yearns for life and desires to see good days?" I want you to notice that St. Benedict is not asking, is there anyone here who is holy enough or good enough to join the monastery? Rather, it is there anyone here who yearns for life and desires to see good days? This means that Benedict recognizes that holiness is not the criteria for entering the monastery, but the desire for holiness, the desire for conversion, the desire to be the goodest, most Christ-like person that I can be. And so when people come to the monastery and folks visit the monastery, what they are going to discover is not a collection of perfected, holy people, but rather we are a community of almost 100, about 90, of young men and old men and middle-aged men who are on the path to holiness, who are striving to be as Christ-like as they can be, which means that we all come with our imperfections. And it's the reason that we have come, because of our imperfections, to have those knocked off and polished off by one another. You can think of the monastery as, I'll put it this way, as a rock polisher. When I was a little kid, I was about 5, my brother was 8. He got a very cool Christmas gift. It was a rock polisher, and I don't know if you've ever seen a rock polisher or not, but his was this canister about this big, and it had a lid, and you would throw into it just some common ordinary rocks, and then a packet of something, I think it was graphite, and you would screw the lid on really tight, and then you would set it on this base. And then you turn it on, and the base would rotate this thing for hours and hours and maybe days and days. And I don't know what caused it to stop, if there was a setting or what, but eventually it would stop. And when it was done, you would unscrew the lid and you would pull out these beautiful, polished, shiny gems of stones. And it occurred to me one day that the monastery is an awful lot like a rock polisher. There are about 90 of us living in a not too big house. And we spend all our days bumping up against one another with the help of the Gospels and working to knock each other's rough edges off and to polish each other up into beautiful, gleaming gems. It's a great metaphor. It emphasizes the notion that a monastery is a community of ordinary people who are here to grow. And it emphasizes the importance of the community. You could take a single rock and throw it into that rock polisher and turn it till the kingdom comes, and it will come out the same rock. But unless we have people living our lives with us, we don't tend to grow. So this myth that one already has to come perfect or be holy as an entrance requirement to the monastery is a myth. What you need is the desire for holiness, the desire to see good days. Now, the second myth that I like to dispel is that people often think that the monastic way is such a hard way of life, that it's a hard way to be a Catholic or to be a Christian. Oh, I could never be a monk. That's for very special people. It's such a hard way. And in some degrees, the monastic life has its challenges. But I actually refer to the monastic life as remedial Christianity. I tend to think of the monastic life, if you'll pardon the expression, as Christianity for dummies. When you consider all of the structures and the expectations that I have built in around me for living a life and keeping me pointed towards conversion and pointed toward being the goodest and most Christ-like person that I can be, that I'm expected every day, 5 times a day, to be at church for Mass and for the Liturgy of Hours, that I'm given 2 more 45-minute periods for Lectio Divina, for scriptural reading and private prayer, that I've given a band of brothers that help me to encourage me and challenge me to live a better life, that I have silence in the house, that we have table reading, that we have all these sorts of things around us every single day, day in, day out, to help me towards this goal of conversion. I think if I can't succeed at Christianity here, I don't have a chance anywhere. So I really do think that if you're called to it, that the monastic life really is almost a remedial form of Christianity. It keeps us so well supported, and it allows us what we need. It has its challenges, of course. Our Father Harry likes to say that the monastic life isn't difficult, it's just relentless. It's there day after day after day after day. But it's not a tough life, it's not a difficult life. The difficulty is sticking with it and realizing that it's a long haul, that it's a marathon and not a sprint, that the rock polisher will take lots and lots of time before we come out the other end with a greater degree of holiness and Christ-likeness. One more idea that I want to introduce in our first session before we wrap it up is this. I've been saying all along that the purpose of the monastic life, which is the purpose of the Christian life, is to grow and to be the most Christ-like person that we can be. Another way that we often say that is that the monastic life, one of its goals, is for us to seek God. Interestingly, it never talks about finding God. The emphasis is always on seeking God. And if we asked ourselves, what does it mean for us to seek God? I think we could translate it this way for our purposes today. That in seeking God, we aim to love God and to serve God. And where is it that we find God to love Him? And where do we find God in order to serve Him? In the Gospels, Jesus is asked, what is the most important commandment? You may remember that. And he doesn't seem able to give just one answer, rather he gives 2. Remember, he says, the first commandment is this, to love God with your whole heart, your whole mind, your whole soul, everything. This conceptualization of loving God, of seeking God, is to develop a relationship with God that is very personal. It's a me and God relationship. Some people refer to this as sort of a vertical relationship with God. God and I, and we carve out this one-on-one, unmediated relationship, He and I. On the other hand, though, Christ doesn't seem to be able to stop there, because in the same breath, he says the second one is just like it, or follows, or can't be separated, and it is, if you will recall, to love your neighbor as yourself. So here we have a horizontal dimension to our seeking of God, that we seek God, meaning we love God, we seek Him out, and we serve Him and love Him in the people that surround us, in our community. I like to think when it comes to vocations, I like to think of vocations as having both of these components. Every vocation in the church has these 2 pieces, because the purpose of our vocation is to grow in our seeking and our loving of God. And so every vocation for us has to have this vertical component and this horizontal component. Now, the vocations that we have to choose among and that we have to sort of find ourselves in differ in the sense that these vertical and horizontal components of how we love God might be distributed a little bit differently. So on the one hand, you have the Carthusians, and I don't know if you know anything about the Carthusians, but the Carthusians are the monks who take a vow of silence. They live an extremely solitary life. There are not many of them. It is indeed a very, very special calling. But they live in total silence. They do live as a group with very little interaction with one another. I think, so their life is very much a very deeply, deeply contemplative relationship with God. They spend almost all of their time and energy pursuing a one-on-one solitary relationship with God. And the horizontal component to their life, I think maybe once a month they take a walk together or something, but their primary direction is to find God in this horizontal dimension. On the other end of the continuum, we could think, for example, of a married man who spends his life really seeking God and serving God and loving God and his spouse and in his children and the people with whom he works. This is where his energies are, and rightly so. He is called to be out in the city and out in the country and out in the world, loving God and the people that surround him, the people who are dear to him and the people who he interacts with. And it is true that he or she, a spouse, is to serve God and to create a relationship with God that is one-on-one, but they don't have the luxury that the Carthusian does, of spending lots of time one-on-one with God, hours at a time in solitude. Now, there are the Trappists. They have a pretty good vertical dimension, but a bit more of a horizontal dimension. You have the diocesan priest, a little bit more of the dimensional, seeking God and serving God and the people of the parish, the people around him, but is also called to develop a personal one-on-one relationship with God as well. In terms of the Benedictine monk, I would say it's kind of an even split. We have lots of opportunities for seeking God in a solitary way. The Liturgy of the Hours, our Lectio Divina, our private prayer, but we also have the community around us who we love and serve and find God in. So a couple of questions that you might think about as you are discerning your relationship with God is this. How, so far in my life, do I experience myself as seeking God and serving God and loving God? Am I the sort of person who is drawn to spending myself in lots of kind of service activities, loving God and the people around me? Or is there a piece to me that is a bit more solitary, that is also called and drawn to a relationship with God that is one-on-one? Now, it's important that we sort of keep that in mind as we discern. Where is it that we feel comfortable? Where is it that we experience God already? But remember that we're not just called to be a place where we can be comfortable, we also should be challenged. And so the second question that we might ask ourselves is, but where do I need to be called? Do I need to be called also to develop a little bit more of the solitude? Or do I need to be called outside of myself and to serve God? And so as we look at different vocations, some vocations might challenge us to more solitude. Some might challenge us to more service and a kind of a greater spending of ourselves. All right, so to summarize what we've talked about in our very first conference today, we've talked about discernment as a process. We've talked about it as making a decision with some struggle, with some work, based on the information that we have available to us. And so we've talked about what some of that information is, how we seek God, how we love God, how we find God. We talked about vocation as growing out of our baptismal vocation, as the flower or the fruit of our baptismal vocation. We've talked a little bit about kind of the myths. Most importantly, that it is not holiness that brings us to the monastic life, but rather the desire for holiness that brings us to a religious life, a monastic life, and I would say to a married life as well. And then we've talked about these different ways of seeking God and serving God and loving God. When I first joined the monastery, my first Christmas here, I had to decide how I was going to explain to all of my friends and relatives exactly what I had done with my life. And so I ended up writing them a Christmas letter. And after some consideration, I landed on this as my description of what I had decided to do. That really the monastic life is really quite ordinary. It's ordinary people, and in lots of ways we're doing very ordinary things. We are teaching and keeping house and plumbing and electrician work and artists and food preparation. We're doing all sorts of very ordinary tasks as ordinary people, living fairly ordinary lives. But we are constantly and intensely seeking God within the very ordinary things and people and activities around us. And that's what makes our life extraordinary. So I invite you to continue with us on our discernment retreat. Our next conference will be on the vows, and invite you to pray before now and then, and to look us up online and consider more about where God might be calling you.